welcome back to the Conservative Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Kayla Ventura. We're continuing a very special episode, The Conservative Case for Community Solar. Part 1 is already aired and is available wherever you get your podcasts. In the last episode, CEN CEO John Soka set the stage, providing the introduction to our panelists, while Coalition for Community Solar New Markets Director Elizabeth Van Holt gave an informational presentation on what community solar is. The episode that you're about to listen to is the panelist question and answer session featuring Conservatives for Clean Energy Virginia State Director Thomas Turner. Please enjoy.
For the panel, and Thomas, since Representative Aragona isn't here, I'm going to ask you this question. You're a conservative, so why do you support community solar?
For me, it's opportunity. We live in a time where we need to diversify our portfolio. I see this opportunity for not just individual states to become energy independent, but our whole country. I always argue this as a national security issue. Having a portfolio of various types of energy puts us on the map to be a more secure country. And as a conservative, we value national security and national defense. And I live in Virginia, home of some of the biggest military populations in the country. So that's just an issue for me, and that's why I support this.
Well, thank you. And I also live in a military community, so it's a big issue for me as well. So as a follow-on for you, Thomas, but when you talk to conservative groups and political parties, when you meet with them in the local communities, how do you really engage them? And how do you address I guess you call it the false narratives that might exist around clean energy sources like community solar?
No, absolutely. Elizabeth hit on it a little bit in her presentation. Recently, I've seen an advancement of grazing here in Virginia, especially where I live. I live in a town called Suffolk, Virginia, which is kind of a rural suburban town. And in that area, we have seen a little bit of solar projects happening in my area. But in particularly, we're seeing the concept of lamb grazing, some of the concept of what Elizabeth was talking about earlier with cows, where we're able to partner with those two and really work on the vegetation and clean up in a very effective way. Secondly, how I talk to conservatives at events and activities is revenue. At the end of the day, lower taxes, seeing that how we've seen solar projects on our school system, solar and things like that, and how that you can reduce the tax rate by bringing in a different form of energy that's not coming from more traditional sources. And dealing with these misconceptions that solar is not safe or solar is kind of in the spirit of, forgive me, that solar is a type of negative force that we're investing in China or other things like that. I really just say, look, we have the capabilities of having those tools here. And we have the capabilities of building those tools here, and investing in our communities brings jobs. For example, this year alone, I had the opportunity of working on the solar installation panel program advisory group and bringing jobs to local communities with trade skills and things like that. So when I start bringing into topics that are hold dear to conservatives, it is an effective way to ease those misconceptions and also bring them to the table and say, wow, this is actually a huge opportunity, not just for the short term, but the long term.
And that's good. So essentially you're meeting people where they are, not where somebody might think they are. You really talk to them at a basic conservative level that they can understand. And that's really good. Elizabeth, I got a question for you. You work all around the country, as we've seen on the chart. So as you've been around the country, are there any trends that you've seen in regard to the reception of community solar at maybe both the state policymaker and the local levels?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I thoroughly enjoy it because when I walk into a state, especially an ag state, Farm Bureau is the first one to say, stop taking our land, stop taking our soil. And then I say, okay, let me tell you about community solar. Let's not talk about solar. Let's talk about, remember, I said that sweet spot in the middle is community solar, right? And I start talking to them about how we partner with landowners, we provide additional revenue, and we use the land that isn't your top prime soil for agriculture, but we're using what, again, my term is the back 40. And all of a sudden I watch the light switch on. And it's like, oh, wait a second, you're not what I thought you were. I said, no, we're not what you thought we were. And now it becomes a conversation of tell me more. I want to connect you with this person. Help them understand what you're doing. And so it becomes this organic growth within what I call under the dome influences. For those of you that are legislators, you know what I'm talking about. Where it becomes them understanding the buy-in for their audiences, whether it be Farm Bureau folks, whether it be county officials. Some of those economic impact studies that I reference, we dive into how much property taxes is our industry going to pay new dollars or additional dollars into these states. How is that funding schools or social services? How are we taking that pressure off of villages and townships now, because there's a little more consistent revenue, at least again 25 years, that's our contract. And so again, it's the more that I get to tell our story, the more people see, kind of John, what you said, meeting them where they are, is they now can understand how their industry or their sector benefits. It is a fascinating, wonderful opportunity for those who haven't seen Under the Dome. Let me know and I will come to your state with a nice piece of community solar legislation for a community near you.
Well, that's great. That's an invitation, and hopefully somebody will take advantage of that and get you to their state. So we're talking about engaging people. Thomas, you talked about it. Elizabeth, you talked about it. Thomas, this one's for you. When you get down to the grassroots level, how do you basically educate them on the advantages of of community solar? Is there anything that you find that isn't talked about enough down at the grassroots level?
I would say yes. I think the biggest thing is really the opportunity for property rights, and I have noticed that a little bit as I had the opportunity of actually doing a panel on energy this year at the Republican Party state retreat, and when we started bringing in the concept of property rights and the concept of like this is people being able, like I always used the argument of farmers who want to retire, and those farmers who are just like, I've been doing this for 40 years and I just don't want to do it anymore. This is an opportunity that I can keep my land and my family, and I can pass on, the next 25 years on to them, and they can have something that they can build upon, and keeping that revenue that I've worked so hard for, so they can use it as well for their family to build on their families. Kind of like a legacy argument. And I'm noticing that we don't talk about that legacy aspect, especially with our older farmers. When I started talking about it in that concept, is that the property can save the family. It does also smooth the mindsets of a lot of people as well. It's like, wow, I didn't even really think about the concept of this is revenue that can come back to my family once unfortunately, when they pass on. So I use the legacy argument in my arsenal.
That's really good. As a former legislator, I had an opportunity to talk to folks who had leased land for solar facilities, and it was very similar things to what you're discussing. Elizabeth, one of the slides you're showing, or that you showed, talked about the benefits to communities and their economies and how they've really benefited from community solar. Can you just share a few maybe specific examples that really how these communities have benefited?
Yeah, and again, I work in new markets, and so I get to take some of these examples and go into states that aren't and say, this could be you. Don't miss this opportunity of some of the other states. And so one of our panels that was supposed to be on here is from Colorado, and they have a wonderful facility, for example, of how you can integrate community solar in a farm setting. They've got the ability, and this is why I'm going to channel my inner Farm Bureau, because I learned quite a bit about farming techniques now over the last few years, but they incorporate drip tape on the bottom of panels, which means now that they can have more consistent irrigation to the crops that are underneath, regardless of if it's raining or not. There's also opportunities for certain panels to create, my words, not science, technological, I promise, or technology. It's the humidity of the water going out of the air, they can capture and bring back in. And so again, it's allowing them to grow and have more opportunities to harvest because there's more opportunities for them to utilize the water that is lost oftentimes in agricultural opportunities. There's also more shade for a lot of the farmers, like the shading opportunity for their sheep and for their cows, because now they don't have to plant the trees that the cows use for scratching. While the tree may not survive past a few years, if you've ever seen a cow and a tree collide, so there's opportunities now where they have integrated the mechanics in the metal of solar panels so that it provides a better quality of life for the livestock. And that again is a burden that's a little bit relieved from farmers. Another one is a manufacturing facility, and it's not the one that you saw, but a different one, same situation. Manufacturing facility that was able to tap into half of that power and reduce their cost of utility by almost 30%. It's unheard of because they bought that much solar. And so now what does that mean? They can afford to pay their employees on the shop floor a better wage because they've saved money on the utilities. They're investing those dollars in their employees on the manufacturing floor. And what do manufacturing employees do? They go buy in their communities. They're grocery shopping, they're buying from retail. And so the dollars are being invested 3 and 4 times back into the community from the very savings from the companies that these companies are tapping into. So again, there's the opportunities to benefit on the communities is limitless as long as we have the permission slip to operate. And this is really the critical obstacle that I have, is getting that legislative permission slip to operate to allow for competition in the energy market. That's where the conversation begins. And when we can get to there, the benefits are limitless, absolutely limitless in the community. So, John, I
And
hope
that's
that
really, I'm sorry, that's really a good segue into a question that was asked on the chat. And it was also one that I wanted to ask too. And Thomas, I'm going to ask you first, since we all know that you're in Virginia. One of the questions was that there's some court cases involving Dominion. And in the bottom line, it was a rather long, involved question. But the bottom line is, how do you see community solar developing in the state of Virginia?
It came up a little bit this past session towards the end. I actually think that there's a lot more opportunity among, especially our conservative legislators, to see actually some movement in that. I did, as I was observing on one of the committees that I was testifying on some other good energy policy on, there were some bills that they sent back not because they were against it, but they wanted to see more work on it and more research. So I think as research comes out and more data comes out, you're going to see more openness to community solar, because a lot of legislators who live in areas where there is a huge opposition to solar farms, community solar takes up smaller land, and it gives them an opportunity to say, hey, you can use this much land to cover this many 3,000 houses. This is a huge opportunity in our county. And so they're like, oh, well, the legislators can be like, yeah, let's do this instead. So I'm seeing a lot of that from, especially in our central Virginia and our more rural areas of Virginia, that opportunity is expanding.
Well, thanks. There's a question in the chat. And Elizabeth, this one's for you. I think it's a really good question because you have solar, and we know that all energy works together. And the question is, how do you integrate storage to ensure against grid interruption? How does that work with community solar?
Yeah, so that's there's actually, I think, a couple of questions there about battery and storage, and I seem to be I'm weirdly becoming more expert in battery opportunities and storage and cold weather versus warm weather and sun versus shine. And so, especially, and I'm in the upper Midwest, and it's getting to that season, everyone's going, see, solar only works in the summer, so what's it going to do for me in the winter? A couple of questions on that is many of our members, our CCSA members, have the option to integrate battery if they choose. And again, this is part of that conversation between the landowner and the developer. This is that conversation between the landowner, the developer, and the community. It's about building the program that's best for the community where they are. So do you necessarily need a battery in every project? No, you don't. Do you need battery or storage in some of the projects? Yes. And so that's where, remember we said legislation isn't one size fits all for all the states. That's where legislators have the opportunity to say, we want to include a storage or battery component in these parts. Maybe it's rural parts, maybe it's the northern part of states that are ice cold. But again, that's where the opportunity, the conversation is in twofold: one, in the legislative side, and two, with the community when we're coming up with the land agreements. But on that issue, and I kind of want to take a small tangent for 60 seconds here,
Uh,
is that there's a fascinating study in New England where FERC reported on the value of solar even in winter and snow times. And they showed that panels, even in those cold times, provide 3 to 5 more percentage points to grid reliability that we could phase ourselves off of some of the older outdated programs that many legislatures are spending money to keep upgraded. And so the technology itself, it's a really fascinating report. I'm happy to share it around in case you can't tell. Nerd in me is excited that even in the winter and in the ice of New England, the panels will still generate power in the cold. And that, to Thomas's point, is that technology is getting better. The conversation then can get better with Republicans and say, look, this isn't just a summertime, this isn't a warm time. This is truly about grid reliability in all parts of your state.
And thank you for taking that detour off into there. If I've heard the statement, what do you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow once? I've heard it 10,000 times. That study, as well as others, are really important to the understanding of the importance of clean energy to our grid. It just is. And I've talked to a number of utilities, and they even agree with that statement because they understand that all these things have to work together. Each form of energy generation has its own strengths and its own, I'm not going to say weaknesses, but their solar doesn't work at night. Actually, it does a very little bit because it is reflected off the moon, which is sunlight, which is what moonlight is. But there's a lot of studies out there. If anybody wants that study, we can get that to you. A question here that somebody asked is, they're asking me this one, as a former state legislator, what would help your former colleagues better understand complex energy issues like community solar? That energy is one of the most complicated policy issues in the whole set of issues that legislators deal with, no matter what state capital you're in. You can't just read 2 articles and become an expert on it. You have to really dig into it. So what I tell folks on that one is that it's about education. Conservative Energy Network, we operate in 24 states. We have folks who talk to legislators as a 501c3. That's what we do. We help educate legislators so they make better decisions that are based in facts, not on how they're feeling today or on how they felt tomorrow or what some talking point of somebody might be, like the sun doesn't shine all the time. I mean, that's not a good way to make good policy. To make good policy, and those who are legislators who may be listening know this, you have to understand what it is that you're voting on. You have to understand what it is people are bringing to you. Ask questions, question one side, talk to the other. You can't get all the answers from any one person or any one group. And what we need to do, all of us on this call, legislator or not, is to work with legislators, work with their staff, bring the facts to them. Elizabeth, there's another question here. This one's for you. It says, is all community solar done by leasing land? Do landowners sometimes do the programs by themselves without leasing it, and they just own the whole thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the definition, well, let me go wonky a little bit for legislators. So when we create the legislation, we define what a private equity company can be that has this opportunity. So landowners themselves, if they want to meet the qualifications of that developer, of that operator, they could put community solar on their property. However, I will say oftentimes it's probably easier to lease the land out, get the benefits of the dollars and not have to worry about the permitting and the interconnection, as someone has asked already, to deal with all the legal and the regulatory combined. But that's not to say we encourage anyone, if you meet these standards that are set in legislation, then you too can have that opportunity for community solar. Again, it's very much a free market principle, which is fascinating to your other question. It's fascinating for people to have that challenge of, wait, this is a free market principle. I'm in a Republican state. I don't know how to say no. And that's the position that we want to put everyone in, is that awkward position of what's next? What other arguments can you send out to me? And I'm happy to respond with factual answers, with landowner narratives, with examples, whatever you need to answer the question that's maybe tough. Lean on our organizations and we will provide you those facts, figures, and resources to be able to go back to your general assemblies and say, this is why we need to have community solar.
Thank you. And now there's a theme here that I've heard both of you talk about. You've talked about lower utility bills with the implication that you're not paying for this with your taxes. We're talking about property rights. You've spoken about farmers and landowners using their property how they see fit, not how some government entity sees fit. And we're really talking about free markets. And if there are conservatives on the call, and I assume that there are, or no matter what your political leaning is, those are things that are important to people in particularly rural areas who are looking at these type of opportunities, not only for community solar, but even utility scale solar. Now there's a question up on my screen here. This one's for you, Elizabeth. It says, does the permission slip, so people are listening, does the permission slip in some states control the cost of interconnection? That's a great question.
It is a good question. So my understanding is it does not control the cost of interconnection, but it controls the timing of interconnection. And so what I mean by that, for many of you who understand interconnection, for those you don't, and I am definitely still learning. So if I misspeak, please do not take that personally against me. I'm learning as I'm going on this piece. But the interconnection costs are in essence set by the utilities. We as community solars community solar members will get 6 or 7 programs together, projects together, and we will petition the utilities to say, how much would it cost to bring, my words, poles and wires off the transmission line out to where our projects are? And the utilities will say 7, 8, 9, $10 million. Those are very, very real numbers. And our our impact studies will show you exactly what the numbers are in these states. And let's just say 10 million for easy math, and there's 10 projects that are all going to benefit from it. So each project divides it up and they say, okay, do we agree to each pay $1 million each to bring the poles and wires and all the necessary technology out there? So while the cost is not controlled in the legislation, the timing oftentimes is. There's also often an encouragement to have it done within a certain time period from when the project is applied to, because interconnection costs or interconnection timing, for those of you who know enough about this more than I do, know that that's often one of those barriers to getting into a market. Is we'll get the permission slip to operate, and then we will start to do the interconnection, and it's like, oh, well, we'll wait 2, 3, 4 years for interconnection. And so we're trying to button that up a little bit in the permission slip to say, all right, you need to do this within a reasonable time frame, whatever that may be for the utility in that market.
And that is a difficult thing to do, because you talk about the queue, and that really goes into the issue of transmission, which is a FERC problem. It's a state problem. It's actually an issue that Conservative Energy Network is beginning to examine. And I'm sure something to come in the future that we'll have a webinar or 2 or 6 on transmission, because that is another issue that people really need to understand. Now here's an interesting question. As a strong distributed solar advocate whose residential electricity has been solar powered since 2012 and a Virginia resident, I believe we need organizations to support distributed solar for whatever reason to work together. And now that's their statement. Now the really question is, what are some effective ways to develop coalitions of folks who do that? For example, faith communities, nonprofit, environmental groups, conservative organizations such as CEN. to advocate cooperatively for better solar policies. I'll take a swing at that one. What we do as a 501c3 is education at state level, at municipal level, at county level, for the general public, at grassroots, grass tops levels. We try and educate people about how solar works, how wind works, how energy storage works, how nuke works. Well, all these things work independently, and more importantly, how they work together. Distributed solar is, we could have another 2 webinars on that as well. It goes back to what I said a minute ago, that electric generation and transmission and distribution and all these different forms of energy is very complicated. So I would recommend, and I'm not sure the background of the person who put the question up, but if you're a legislator, come to us. We will help educate you on that. Talk to Elizabeth about community solar. If you're not a legislator, but you're in another nonprofit, call us. We can talk. If you're just an interested individual, call me and we can have that conversation. It comes back to state legislators cannot make good legislation unless they have 2 things. First, they have to have the knowledge of what they're talking about for good legislation. And secondly, they need their constituents to contact them so that they know that people care about it. And I've said this to numerous groups when I was in the legislature. The best thing you can do as a person who might not be elected, but you're just in a community trying to make things happen, you have to talk to your state legislators. And if it's a federal issue, talk to your congressmen and US senators. For state legislators, it's a little bit easier. And I always make the suggestion, make that connection in the home district when your elected representatives are home. When they're in session, just like Representative Aragona today, he still hasn't been able to show up. He's still in session. I think they're on the floor voting on some issues, so he couldn't be with us. Time is at a premium. When you come home from the legislature, you want to talk to people. You might have meetings or whatever, but if you reach out to folks, I haven't met a legislator of either party who doesn't want to hear what their constituents really are concerned about. We're almost at the end of our time. So I'll just let Thomas and Elizabeth have a closing statement, if you will. So Thomas, we'll go with you first. What do you want people to remember from this? And what are the real takeaways you'd like them to have?
That the economic opportunities of community solar can really change the financial opportunities that you can do in your towns, especially when it comes to lower taxes. And also, just to add to that coalition aspect is, there are many friends in every aspect of the business community. As I found even recently, I did a small event, just like a happy hour type event in the Hampton Roads area, Tidewater area of Virginia. Out of that event, with some of our CEN friends, John, we were able to sit in on a solar installation panel, as I talked about earlier, and that we were the only ones in the room. A conservative group was for help formulating a trade education program, and it was mainly based out of conservative ideals. So the opportunities are always endless.
And thank you, Elizabeth. Your closing statement, if you will.
Yeah, I'm just going to say the 2 questions that are left are, how do you talk to Republicans and what do we do for Indiana? I'm a proud Boilermaker, so reach out to me and I will help you in Indiana. Our football team is but we can get community solar in there. That being said, community solar isn't a Republican or Democrat conversation. It's about how do we save money for ratepayers, constituents, and at the end of the day, voters. And that's the information that we can help provide to give legislators that better understanding on. It's about the jobs, it's about the dollars, it's about the tax revenue. Keep it very factual. Keep it about the economy. I know there's some jokes in politics from previous generations. I'm just going to leave it there. But really, community solar is that sweet spot. When I say we're right in the middle, we really are. We're not 300 acres of land taking up good, fertile agricultural soil. We're not rooftop, because a lot of the families can't operate and can't own it, can't fund it. We fit that really perfect middle ground, and it's that community engagement that we do and that community generation of locally produced energy, and some states know what I'm talking about here. It's not brought in from other states. We can help with that. So again, happy to talk about Indiana. There's a special place in my heart for it. And Republicans, it's about dollars and cents.
That was a good wrap up. They were both good wrap ups. And I'd like to thank both of you today for being panelists, for joining us today on this, what I consider to be a very important webinar. You shared your experience, your great insights. Community solar is really important. And this was very valuable for me, I can tell you that, and hopefully for everybody who tuned in. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you for listening to the conclusion of the Conservative Case for Community Solar on the Conservative Energy Podcast. You can join the Community Solar Freedom Coalition today by visiting www.communitysolarfreedomcoalition.org and learn more about community solar on the Clean Future Academy website, which you can find at www.conservativeenergy.org/CFA/community-solar. You can learn more about CEN by visiting www.conservativeenergynetwork.org. Find us on LinkedIn at Conservative Energy Network, Facebook at Conservative Energy Network, and X at Cons Energy Net. Listen to the Conservative Energy Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day.